So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Susan.
Thank you very much, Emily. And I'm so honored to be with you all today, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I know if your professional lives are anything like mine, this is a crazy busy time of the semester, so I hope that what you'll hear and what we'll get to talk about today is going to be really useful for you. What we're going to talk about are some of the experiences that I've had with using a writing in the disciplines approach in first-year or foundational writing courses. Much of what we'll talk about today is drawn from the book that Emily mentioned, An Insider's Guide to Academic Writing, which I recently co-authored with Roy Stamper and Stacy Cochran. And the book grew out of experiences that Roy, Stacy, and I had teaching in, and for me, directing a first-year writing program. It was at North Carolina State University that focused on implementing a writing in the disciplines approach. I directed the program there from 2007 until this past summer when I moved to Arizona. And for the 8 years that I directed the program, we really struggled as a faculty to search for texts that supported a rhetorically based approach to writing in the disciplines. And we had difficulty finding anything that met our 3 criteria for a supporting textbook for that approach. We wanted a book that included an introduction to rhetorical principles, examples that were drawn from academic sources, and a discussion of writing in different academic disciplines. And here, I'm going to advance the slide here for you. In our program at NC State, most teachers primarily used one of 2 approaches, either having students walk through different academic disciplines, either by analyzing or practicing them, or sometimes by using a combination of those 2, or they used a theme-based approach where they would explore how different disciplines approached a particular object of study. During the webinar, I'll point you to several examples of how you might implement these kinds of approaches on large or small scales in your own classes and programs. In the first part of the webinar, we'll talk about what writing in the disciplines means and what the potential advantages are to using such an approach in foundational writing courses. And then in the second and third parts of the webinar, we'll go through 2 different approaches to writing in the disciplines. First, I'll talk about an approach to writing about writing in the disciplines, kind of a metacognitive approach. And we'll look at 2 examples of assignments that students might complete in that kind of an approach. And then finally, we'll discuss having students explore and actually practice disciplinary genres. And I'll walk you through some of the genres that teachers might consider having students practice in a writing class. So let's go ahead and get started. When I first arrived at NC State, I had a lot of questions about how to teach writing in the disciplines, let alone direct a program that used that approach. I had not really used an approach like that in the past. I wrote about these questions in a recent blog post on the Macmillan website, and one of the first questions that I had, maybe embarrassingly, was a pretty basic one. What exactly is WID, and how is it related to or different from writing across the curriculum? What I found is that it's useful to think of writing in the disciplines as being, in some ways, under a larger umbrella of writing across the curriculum. Writing across the curriculum includes many different kinds of efforts that are related to writing across the college or university. And for those of you that are at institutions that have writing across the curriculum programs, you might see them manifest in different ways. Sometimes those efforts include incorporating low-stakes writing-to-learn activities into classes in a wide range of disciplines. And sometimes it also includes helping students understand the conventions of writing in different academic disciplines. Writing in the disciplines is usually understood as the latter part of that description, so various approaches to studying and helping students practice and master the conventions of writing in various fields of study. While writing in the disciplines courses and initiatives often are focused on students at the upper division level as they work through classes in their majors, a writing in the disciplines approach can also have a really powerful place in foundational writing courses by helping to build a bridge to those upper division courses and helping students understand how rhetorical knowledge can be helpful in transferring that knowledge to other courses that they take in their majors and ideally to their professions beyond that. I've especially found it to be powerful for students when they are analyzing, understanding, and writing about writing in the disciplines in foundational writing courses. But considering teaching a writing in the disciplines approach, or if you direct a program, moving your program in that direction can be really challenging. One of the challenges that I found, and probably the initial one that I dealt with, even for myself, was faculty comfort level. So for a teacher with a background in English, which for many of us, that's who we're working with in our programs, talking about writing in other disciplinary areas can be uncomfortable and unfamiliar. I felt uncomfortable with it at first, with the idea of talking about specifically writing in the sciences, for example, even though I did, believe it or not, start out as a pre-med major in college, but that was a really long time ago. And I imagine that other faculty in my program might feel uncomfortable with that idea of talking about writing in other disciplinary areas than their own, kind of unfamiliar. That is, until I realized that I could draw on my disciplinary expertise in rhetoric and my understanding of rhetorical principles as the framework for talking about writing in other disciplinary areas. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. Another challenge that I found is figuring out how to facilitate transfer of knowledge. I was concerned at first that I would potentially be teaching inaccurate information about disciplinary genres and that students would transfer that knowledge in ways that were disruptive to their success and not facilitating it. Liz Wardle talks about some of those complications in her often cited article from 3Cs, and she talks about what she terms MUT genres and the challenges of transfer from the first year writing course. And then finally, as an administrator, I was concerned about emphasizing even more the service nature of a foundational writing course. I wanted to be sure that the knowledge our field has developed about writing, genres, conventions, processes, and about effective teaching of writing was not lost in an effort to prioritize what other disciplines might think that we should be teaching. What I began to realize, though, was that the most effective way of teaching a writing in the disciplines approach in a first-year writing course doesn't solely emphasize mastery of various disciplinary genres. Instead, if I drew on the disciplinary expertise of the writing faculty teaching the courses, focusing on rhetorical principles, close observation and analysis of text, and understanding the context of writing, then the rhetorical context in a writing in the discipline focused course just happened to be writing in different academic disciplines. I was just shifting the focus of the rhetorical contexts that we were going to be discussing in my class. And then students were engaged in close rhetorical reading of writing in different disciplinary areas. Using this approach, I realized that students could potentially leave my first-year writing class better prepared to write in contexts outside of my class, either in their other classes or in their profession later on, because they would know what to pay attention to, even as they encountered contexts we never discussed in my class, because of course they were going to. I couldn't cover every possible disciplinary genre that they might encounter, or if I even tried to, I would have been oversimplifying those genres in ways potentially that would be damaging to students. So once I began to take what I knew about writing in rhetorical context and apply it to a writing in the disciplines course, and then help other teachers to do the same, my list of reasons not to teach writing in the disciplines were immediately countered by arguments for why it seemed like a really good idea. Faculty were able to teach students rhetorical principles in a rich, meaningful context for the students, and both students and I could see the potential for transfer with this approach, and we would talk about it in class a great deal, talking about the kinds of things that they were encountering in other classes and how what we were talking about in our writing class might potentially help them as they encountered those other writing contexts. And then students understood the exigency of the course content because they saw that potential for transfer. The rhetorical knowledge that they were gaining in the course had immediate application for them. Ideally, I want you to be able to leave the webinar today with some very practical ideas about how you might implement a writing in the disciplines-based approach in your own classes, whether that be just for a day of your class, maybe in a unit of your course, or perhaps in an entire class, if that's the direction that you would like to go. In the next two sections of the webinar, as I said before, we're going to talk about two potential approaches to teaching writing in the disciplines, both of which are supported by an Insider's Guide to Academic Writing. I'll first explain kind of how the approach works, and then give examples of the kinds of assignments you might have students do if implementing that approach in your course. In the first approach, students are analyzing and writing about writing in the disciplines. In order to implement this kind of an approach, though, and to do it effectively, instructors do need to have preparation and foundation in a few areas. They need to understand rhetorical situations and context. They need to talk about how genres work and what they do, especially in academic contexts. And they do also need to have access to approachable examples of academic writing in a range of disciplines. And it's really okay here to think beyond scholarly articles. In fact, I encourage you to do that sometimes. Not that you should stay away from scholarly articles, but academics write other kinds of things too. And one of the things that Roy and Stacy and I found when we interviewed Mike Brotherton, who is, he's featured in the book, he's an astrophysicist at the University of Wyoming. He talked about different kinds of writing that he does in his discipline, not just the scholarly articles, but how he talks about that in other contexts. And so looking at different kinds of genres that academics produce could be very useful too. Think about even collecting examples of the kinds of assignments that students might encounter in other courses and the kinds of writing that their faculty members do, making it concrete for students so that they understand the relevance of the approach is really important for them. The foundation of this kind of an approach is teaching students how to conduct a rhetorical analysis and giving them an appropriate framework or set of frameworks for analyzing something rhetorically. They might analyze the rhetorical situation of a text. They might analyze the way an argument is structured in different academic disciplines. They might analyze the kind of evidence that is used to support an argument. Or they might analyze the conventions of the genre that they are looking at, just to name a few. And there are certainly other frameworks that might be useful as well. So let's talk about a few examples of assignments. I'm going to talk through three different kinds of assignments that you might have students do that would support this kind of an approach to WID, or writing in the disciplines. First, you could have students write a fairly straightforward rhetorical analysis of an academic text. This slide includes some of the instructions that are given for a rhetorical analysis assignment in Chapter 5 of an Insider's Guide. And in this assignment, we reference a framework that we introduce in the book, which is analyzing the structure of the text and then the language and referencing conventions of the text that they're looking at. But you could certainly have students use other rhetorical frameworks as well, depending on what you usually emphasize in your course or what's generally emphasized in your program. Another option that's very similar to this is to have students compare two different academic texts, and you can still use this basic framework of a rhetorical analysis. I mentioned earlier that several of our instructors at NC State would use a more theme-based approach to explore how different disciplines approached a particular object of study. And this idea of comparing two different academic texts is one that's supported in Part 3 of an Insider's Guide, where we have a reader that's organized by thematic chapters. So each chapter includes a range of readings from popular and academic sources representing a variety of different disciplinary perspectives on the same topic. So students can think about different kinds of questions that scholars in different disciplines might ask about a particular phenomenon, or different methods of inquiry in different disciplines. And for our final assignment at NC State in English 101, and it was the assignment that we used for our program assessment as well, students were asked to choose two different academic sources from different disciplines and then write a comparative rhetorical analysis. There's an example of an assignment for a comparative rhetorical analysis on page 101. It's in Chapter 5 of an Insider's Guide. But that foundation, having a solid foundation in rhetorical analysis, is really key to what students do in a writing in the disciplines course, especially a first-year writing course. And it usually is the place where I start the course. Another possibility, though, a third approach, and this is one that many students find appealing, is exploring the similarities and differences in different kinds of texts that academics write for different audiences. Two ways to do this. One that's very popular is to compare the features, purposes, and audiences for scholarly and popular articles about the same topic. But another option is the one that I have on this slide, and that's to translate a scholarly article for a more public audience. Now, of course, the topic that the student is translating the article about needs to be something that they kind of understand. So drawing on things that they might be encountering in their major that they already have some experience with or interest in could be really important here. This assignment also appears in the Insider's Guide, and we include a student example, which I'll pull up part of it for you here. So this is an example of an article in the Sciences that was translated into a press release by a student. In the book, we also include a professional model of this kind of translation from Mike Brotherton, the astrophysicist that I mentioned earlier, where he translates one of his own articles into a press release for a more public audience. And then he also reflects on some of the successes and failures of his attempt at that press release, which is very interesting. And he talks about why he made the choices he did when writing it, and which choices he made seemed to work well, and which ones perhaps did not work as effectively. Another broad approach to teaching writing in the disciplines is to have students explore and actually practice different disciplinary genres. And I do want to take a moment and say that the two broad approaches that I'm talking about here are not in any way mutually exclusive. In fact, in my own courses, I almost never just do one or the other. What I've found to be a really successful approach is to maybe have students start with an analysis, like the rhetorical analysis that I mentioned earlier, writing in the disciplines, and then maybe try an imitation of a disciplinary genre that they've encountered, and then end perhaps with another additional analysis going back and forth between the approaches in a way that really encourages metacognitive critical reflection from the students about the genres that they're encountering and about the application of the rhetorical knowledge that they're learning in the course. Understandably, some instructors are uncomfortable with having students practice genres or practice disciplinary conventions with which they aren't familiar. And this kind of pushes at our discomfort with not always being an expert in the room. Stacy Cochran, one of my co-authors, wrote a really great blog post on the Macmillan website a few weeks ago, and the subtitle of it was How I Became an Expert at Not Being an Expert. And he talks about some of the approaches that he uses working with students when they are writing about things, about topics, or perhaps exploring genres with which he isn't familiar. I do want to say, though, that this kind of approach can be a really great way to have instructors introduce their own scholarly interests and or training into a writing course. One instructor that I worked with at NC State had training in applied linguistics, for example, and specifically she had studied sociolinguistics and was interested in dialect variation. And so she had students doing small-scale studies and explorations that were within her area of interest and her area of expertise, and they were genres and methods of inquiry that she was really familiar with. A lot of times we think about, or we hear people talk about using literature in writing courses as kind of taboo, and I want to suggest that this kind of an approach can also be a really wonderful way to have instructors introduce literary analysis or their own disciplinary expertise into a course in a way that is really constructive for students. This could be an example or an opportunity to have students practice a literary analysis, for example, and then analyze what they have done in the literary analysis from a rhetorical perspective. Understanding literary analysis not just as the only kind of writing that they're encountering, which sometimes, not always, but that's sometimes what they've encountered in high school, but understanding that as one way of knowing and a method of inquiry and a kind of disciplinary writing that is valued in several fields. So if you do choose to have students practice various disciplinary genres in their class, there are a few guidelines that I think can really help make this kind of approach as successful as possible. First, it's important to remind students that they aren't memorizing formula for writing across the college or university. And this is really important. What we don't want is to have this sort of practice or study of genres turn into a kind of current traditional formulaic way of teaching writing. Instead, we want students to understand that they're learning to ask smart, rhetorically focused questions about what writing conventions are followed in a specific field, how arguments are shaped, what evidence is used, what questions are asked, what methods of inquiry are most common, and really what is valued in that field. That can be challenging for students because, of course, as we know, often they want us to show them exactly what those genres should look like and what steps to follow. But using a kind of inductive approach to understanding what the genres are doing can be a really effective way of approaching that. Second, I think it's important to remember that imitation has a really important place in this approach. Imitation was a common method of rhetorical instruction in the ancient world, and it has a really useful role for students today. Historically, imitation has often dealt with playing around with form and content, either using the same form and supplying different content, which is what students would be doing if they're imitating genre conventions in a discipline, but they're, say, reporting data that they've collected on their own. So they're using a form that looks similar but supplying different content, or using the same content and constructing it in a new form, which is what they would be doing with the translation of a scholarly article assignment that I mentioned earlier. Clearly, there is a lot of crossover, as I said, between these two approaches, and they're not necessarily discrete. But imitation can be a really important part of this process. Additionally, research in genre studies reminds us that it's important to talk about what the genre is accomplishing, what it's doing, and not just focus on elements of structure or surface level conventions. It can be useful, for example, to have students consider whether there are different genres accomplishing similar purposes across disciplines. And I'll talk about some examples of that in a minute too. The reflection that students do about the genre that they're producing or imitating is really one of the most important elements of this kind of approach. And finally, it's good to turn to guidance from professionals in different fields when you can. In an Insider's Guide, we provide videos and interviews with various scholars in different disciplines that help with this. In some cases, I've seen teachers successfully have students maybe interview a professional or an academic in their field of study to talk to them about the conventions of writing in their field, the kinds of writing that they do in their field, and maybe even how they learned those conventions, which can be a really interesting question for students to explore. Or maybe have them, if they're doing, say, that rhetorical analysis assignment that I mentioned earlier, have them analyze the work of a faculty member that they know first, as they're understanding what the conventions are of the genres that they're looking at. But these guidelines can give a really solid foundation to then introducing students to practicing specific genres that they're encountering in different fields. There are a really wide range of genres that you might have students practice or experiment with. And the list that I have here is certainly not at all an exhaustive list. I've listed some discipline-specific genres that you might consider. So earlier I mentioned the possibility of using literary analysis, which would be an interpretation of a text. And the key is to have students analyze the literary analysis that they're producing as a way of knowing and as a method of inquiry and as a specific disciplinary genre. Other kinds of textual interpretations can also be interesting. For example, artistic interpretations or historical interpretations of a text. You could also have students create an artistic text. And again, I'm thinking of ways to really draw on the expertise of many of the teachers that we have in our writing program. So In the program that I directed at NC State, and then also here at the University of Arizona, we have a lot of teachers who have expertise in creative writing. And I've seen teachers use the creation of an artistic text and then reflection on that experience very successfully. I've also seen teachers have students engage in pottery making and then reflecting on that experience, computer coding, different kinds of things that they have expertise in, and then reflecting on the various genres that they're working in, using those kinds of rhetorical frameworks that we talked about earlier. Lab reports are one of the most common scientific and social scientific texts that we might think of, having students practice. But even having students keep a detailed log of observations or data with reflections can be a very useful practice. They can talk about the process of data collection, assumptions about what counts as evidence in different disciplines, and then also different methods of inquiry in various different disciplines. There are a wide range, too, of genres from professions and applied fields that can be very useful to have students practice or explore. I've seen teachers successfully have students imitate bids in response to requests for proposals. So perhaps writing a proposal for a bid, that is kind of related to, on the other column, the research proposal that I mentioned, too. There are some similarities that could be interesting to explore. I've also seen teachers have students develop business plans and then talk about how those business plans are structured. But these are all ways of having students understand the role that writing plays in their future professional lives. And these are areas, as I said earlier, where it can be really useful to draw on the expertise of faculty who are interested and willing in different disciplines to talk about the role that writing plays in what they do. I have a colleague here at the University of Arizona who's in psychiatry, and when he found out that I direct the writing program, he just spontaneously said, you know, if you ever have a need to have a scientist come talk about the kinds of writing that they do, I would love to come do that. One of the things that we did successfully to draw on that expertise at NC State was to host a panel of faculty in different disciplines for our writing faculty. We invited 4 faculty to come sit on the panel, and they talked about the expectations that they had for writing in their classes, the kinds of assignments that they have students do, and the kinds of writing that they do as scholars and professionals in those fields. So thinking of creative ways to draw on expertise from colleagues can be really helpful for students and for faculty. But I'll also point out, and you probably have already thought of this, it can also be a really wonderful way to build connections between the writing program and other things going on in the university. I think we often have difficulty with communicating what the writing program is doing or what writing courses, why they're structured the way that they are to our colleagues in different fields. And whether you're at a really large university or at a fairly small liberal arts school or at a community college, having good ways of building those kinds of connections with colleagues, ways to draw on their expertise and to demonstrate to them how the course is building important disciplinary knowledge for students and helping them transfer that knowledge into their courses can be really great. I want to talk about some of these genres that cross disciplinary boundaries as well. And again, not anywhere close to an exhaustive list, but just some ideas to sort of get you started. Many genres cross disciplinary boundaries, although they might have slightly different conventions in the way that they appear in different disciplines. And as we also know, they can have slightly different conventions within the same discipline, depending on what journal they appear in or what the purpose is for writing it or the specific training of the researcher. But there are a lot of these genres that do cross disciplinary boundaries, and this can be a space where talking about the purpose of various genres can also be interesting. I had mentioned that earlier. So for example, those first 2 bullets, annotated bibliographies and reviews of literature, have similar purposes. They compile and report on prior research, but they do that work in different ways. Reviews of literature also show relationships between different sources and put them in conversation with each other in more overt ways than most annotated bibliographies do. But both are common genres in multiple disciplines. Abstracts and research proposals are two additional genres that students can really find useful to practice because they tend to encounter them later on in their academic careers. Depending on their discipline, they may or may not encounter them more often, but I use research proposals sometimes as a way to launch writing courses that I'm teaching that are more theme-based, where students choose an object of study and then explore that topic through various disciplinary lenses. So I'll start with a research proposal where I have them talk about why they're choosing the topic of study and how they're anticipating it might be relevant to different disciplines, and often they're speculating in that regard. And then when I have them write an annotated bibliography or a review of literature, I ask them specifically to find sources from different disciplines to reflect those different disciplinary perspectives. A useful framework for thinking about what genres you might have students practice and explore if you want to draw on genres that cross disciplines is Mike Carter's concept of meta-genres. And this is from an article that he wrote in 2007 in 3Cs. And in that article, he identifies 4 meta-genres that cross disciplinary categories. And these 4 meta-genres might give you other ideas about genres that will help students make connections with other courses that they're taking in meaningful ways. Ultimately, there are several different ways you could incorporate a writing in the disciplines approach into a foundational writing course. And none of these assignments or ideas that I'm sharing with you are mutually exclusive. But I hope that you'll find these suggestions to be helpful. And I look forward to some conversation during the Q&A and to hearing about the kinds of things that you try in your own classes. So thanks again for joining us. I'm going to stop the presentation part of this and then open it up to questions that you might have or things that we can talk about related to using a writing in the disciplines approach. Thanks.
Hey, Susan.
Yes.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A that were asked during the presentation.
I can't see any of them.
Then I will go ahead and tell you what they say.
I was watching, but the only thing I saw was the comment from Jeremy Godfrey that he was leaving early.
Oh, yeah, this is in the Q&A window, which probably isn't up. From Wei Zhang, I assume that there are international freshmen in the comp program in NCC, like in many universities across the country. Did you implement WID with them? What tips or adaptations that you feel are necessary to implement WID with international students?
Okay, that's a great question. And this is an area that is really near and dear to my heart, too, because much of my training is in working with international students and second language writers. So we did have quite a few international students. Fewer at the undergraduate level at NC State than we do here at the University of Arizona, but several that were in our classes where we were using this writing in the disciplines approach. And we did have, at NC State, separate courses for ESL students, as some universities do. And those courses did also use a writing in the disciplines approach, too. So a couple of the things that I would suggest is that this is an area where it really is important to choose scholarly texts that are accessible to students, depending on what the language proficiency of the students are that are coming into your college or university. You definitely don't want to hit them right at the beginning of the semester with highly scientific texts that are challenging for them. So I would suggest this is a place where you could draw on genres that might be a little bit more familiar or more accessible to students that aren't using highly scientific language at first. This also is an opportunity, I think, to provide them some guidelines. I mentioned using a kind of inductive approach to having students discover what the conventions of the genres are. And you might, and you know, this isn't just true for international students, but for a wide range of students in first-year courses. Give them some guidelines for how to start that inquiry. Another thing that I would suggest, Stacy, one of my co-authors, is going to be piloting this approach in a basic writing course in the spring. And one of the things that, that we've been talking about is how it's important to maybe start the course by talking about what the expectations of college writing are. What kinds of things might students expect to encounter, and what are some of the variations that they might see? And a lot of what this approach is about is demystifying some of what they're encountering in college writing classes. And often, as professors and teachers in college classes, we're not always really good at remembering what it was like to encounter these different genres for the first time. So I think keeping that in mind, it doesn't just help our international students, but it helps all of the students that we would encounter in first-year writing classes.
Great. So there are a couple more questions. One just came up in the Q&A. Would you talk a little bit about how some of this thinking might be applied across a two-course sequence? For example, what would a Comp 1 look like in relation to Comp 2?
Well, that's a great question. So there are a couple of different ways that you can that you could divide this over a two-course sequence. And I should clarify, at NC State, we did just have a one-semester requirement. It was a 4-credit-hour course, and this was what we taught in that course. So if you're dividing it over a 2-semester sequence, there are a couple of different ways that you can approach that. One suggestion that I would make is using that first semester as a space where you introduce students to the kinds of expectations that they might encounter in college writing. There are some things like the WPA outcome statement, the framework for success in post-secondary writing, that can really help students to understand what those expectations might be, introduce them to what it means to read texts rhetorically, the kinds of frameworks that you might want to use later, you could introduce in that first semester. And then maybe start to introduce them to how to analyze academic texts, but perhaps save in the second semester some of the more intense research and decoding of scholarly texts as what they would do in the second semester of the course. That's just one suggestion. I would be really interested to hear other ideas that some of the attendees have if you've tried using this kind of an approach over 2 semesters as well. That's something I'm having to think about here at U of A for the first time if I wanted to use this kind of an approach in any courses as well.
Awesome. So we have another question from Dev Bose. Thanks for this helpful presentation. Are there any suggestions to have students bring in knowledge of their own disciplines into the classroom? How much knowledge of the discipline should instructors be aware of?
Great question, Dev. So this can be kind of tricky. And again, this varies from how you would approach this can vary from school to school, too. So I'll just give the context of 3 different schools that I have taught at. So I first taught at Mesa Community College, which is a fairly large urban community college in the Phoenix area. And then I was at NC State and now here at the University of Arizona. So when I was at Mesa, most of the students that I was working with in our first-year writing sequence really didn't have a sense of what their major would be. They might have professional aspirations, some of them did, but as they were taking those gen ed requirements, that was really a time of exploration for them. And so trying to have them identify, okay, well, what's your major and what are the conventions of writing in your field weren't always, those weren't always really relevant questions for them. Now at NC State, when students applied to the university, they had to declare a major. They actually applied to specific colleges. So they might come in with an idea of what they think their major would be. But as we all know, sometimes that changes. I'm an example of that. I changed my undergraduate major every year I was an undergrad. So some students might come in with a certain idea of what they think they want to do, but as they're taking those introductory courses, sometimes that shifts too. And that here at U of A, I see a wide range of students, some who have declared majors and seem to know what it is that they really want to do, others that are still kind of in that exploration stage. So to actually answer your question, I guess I'm sort of saying the answer varies depending on where you are. But some of the ways that can be really interesting to have students start to draw on that knowledge is if you have students who are taking some of those introductory courses in areas either that they're majoring in or that they think they might major in, having them bring in examples of the kinds of writing that they either are being asked to do in those courses or that they're reading in those courses, and using those as the basis of analysis in the course can be very interesting. Another thing that I've seen teachers use very successfully is to have students actually look for a piece of writing published by one of the professors that they have that semester in another class. That can be really interesting. That's a way to kind of get around whether or not they know what their major is. I mean, if they do, then have them choose something from a professor in a major that they know that they're interested in. But really having them look at the writing that is being published by faculty that they're working with can help them understand that these are people writing these texts as well. And then drawing on the writing that they're encountering in their other classes is one of the ways to facilitate transfer between courses in ways that I think can be really beneficial. And I'm sort of answering Megan O'Neill's question that I see posted there as well. That's one way to kind of help address and facilitate transfer from what you're talking about in the course directly into other classes that students are enrolled in at the same time. So just a couple of ideas there.
Great. Thank you, Susan. If anyone has more questions, please put them in the Q&A window. This has been really great so far. You guys have been very participative. By the way, a recording of today's workshop will be made available on our Macmillan community website, where a number of our authors blog. Wait maybe one more minute. Chris Gayer just got in under the wire. Hi, these are all great ideas. My question is, how can I, a person trained in rhetoric and composition, distribute a program based on WID principles across a teaching corp of adjunct instructors who are mostly MAs?
So, really good question. In the couple of programs that I have worked in, Chris, at NC State, we had primarily full-time non-tenure track faculty, so full-time lecturers, and then a small cohort of graduate students. And then in the program that I'm in now, most of our classes are taught by graduate students, and then a smaller cohort of full-time and adjunct faculty. But of course, at many colleges and universities, the majority of classes are taught by part-time or adjunct faculty, and that can be a very transient population who may or may not have training in rhetoric and composition. And I know that can make this approach challenging, especially since I was sort of saying, here are different things that faculty need to have a foundation in order to implement this approach. And a great deal of that is rhetorical knowledge or knowledge of genre and genres and how they work, which is the kind of training that you might have in a Rhet Comp program, but maybe not in other programs. So one suggestion that I'd make is if you do have adjuncts who primarily come from literary studies or from creative writing, what I would suggest is that you start by talking about what is common among these different disciplinary areas and the inquiry that they do, and then what the training is of those faculty. So what our colleagues who have training in literature and creative writing and linguistics and Rhet Comp often have in common is that they're very good at analysis of text and understanding how language works And in literary studies specifically, they use the term close reading. They're very good at close reading. And so what I often explain to teachers is that what they're doing is they're drawing on those skills that they have and maybe learning new frameworks for doing that work, maybe more rhetorically based frameworks. But what we're doing is we're analyzing text, and that really does draw on what the expertise is that they already have. There are a couple of suggestions that I made in a blog post on the Macmillan website. I think it was posted last Friday, about different kinds of professional development that you can do too. Now, of course, the big challenge is if you have adjunct faculty who are perhaps teaching at multiple institutions, they might be required to teach a variety of different curricula or different kinds of assignments, and they may or may not have, understandably, time or a vested interest in participating in professional development. You know, these ideas may or may not work very well. I have found that even in programs that employ a large group of adjunct faculty, that having maybe one meeting at the beginning of each semester that sort of kicks the semester off, that faculty can expect that they're going to attend, and that maybe is offered at a time that would be outside of the times that they might be working in other contexts. I know that's hard to do, but that might be a place where you could do something like the panel of faculty from different disciplines. And that might be kind of eye-opening to them. Or use that as a space for talking about some basic rhetorical principles and concepts that, that would be useful for employing this kind of an approach. But the question of how to help and support adjunct faculty or faculty who are new to teaching this kind of an approach is exactly why we wrote this book. Because frankly, we had found a few books that sort of did what I talked about at the beginning. We had those criteria we were looking for, but we didn't really have anything that kind of walked teachers through how to employ this kind of an approach and provided an assignments that would really help teachers do it effectively. So I think the key too is really having a text that can support those teachers and have some ideas for them about the kinds of assignment sequences that might work and be comfortable for faculty from a range of different disciplinary backgrounds. I hope that helps, Chris. I mean, there's not a really easy answer to that, and man, we could do a whole different webinar on talking about labor issues in writing programs too, and how to support faculty and advocate for better working conditions. But that's a different topic. I hope that those suggestions are really helpful.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to everybody for attending today. We appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule, especially during this part of the semester, to come to our presentation. As I said, we will be posting a recording of today's slides to the Macmillan Community website. Thank you again, Susan, and to everybody still in, have a good weekend.
All right, thanks very much.